understand your concern about these particular issues, but my time is greatly taken up with other things. Morel was not in the least slightest bit interested whether he was taken up with other things, and eventually he got the Archbishop on side, but he was a very, very determined man. Now, if I don't want to go on too long, but we do have to ask the question how successful he was in his campaign, because the campaign eventually did succeed, and the Belgian government took over the Congo. I mean, this is a very brief summary of it all, but the Congo eventually passed the Belgian government. And I do have to say, and I say this in my book, that actually it has been said that the Congo exchanged a brutal, deeply authoritarian master for a rule by a ruthlessly exploitative state in the form of Belgium, the missions and the major commercial enterprises. Yes, the random killing, amputations and brutal beatings ceased, but the new administration fell far short of Morel's ideals, and he did not let up in his campaign for further reforms. And today we see the Congo greatly damaged by this dreadful history, first King Leopold, and then, quite frankly, a Belgian administration, which I think I am underright in quite saying that only 3 members of the Congo territory were ever involved in the civil service of the Belgian administration. They never educated anybody up to cope with the administration of the Congo whatsoever.
That's correct.
And then, of course, Lumumba was murdered on the orders largely of President Eisenhower when he came to when Lumumba came to power. So the poor old Congo has had to suffer a great deal at the hands of Europeans and others. Anyway, in 1912, now, am I going on too long? Do you want me to go on? So what I would like to say, what I want to say is that this was only a third of Morel's life. The rest of his life, 2/3 of his life, was acting for, he joined the Union for Democratic Control just before the outbreak of war, to call to account the government for its involvement in the war. Now, this is very complex, but Morel went on campaigning for this area and throughout the war. And by this time, he moved to Hertfordshire, and actually said when he got to London it was too noisy. He was living quite close to the A1, it is very noisy, I've been down there. But in commemorating his humanitarian campaign, I think we must remember his tremendous work and his total commitment and horror at the war. Now, Prime Minister has just spoken about the war, and we're now within approximately just under 2 years on the anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War, and I hope that people will take notice of what Morel did during that terrible conflagration and that dreadful slaughter. Because the latter years of his life were directed at revealing the causes of the war, and particularly the secret lies and treaties that led up to it. It's all very complex, but this is where it in fact becomes extremely interesting in his life, because there are a lot of parallels with what happened in Iraq quite recently, in almost precise terms, where you can say that there was a lot, the democratic control that was taking a country to war was not properly exercised. And he became a vigorous and outspoken critic of Lloyd George, and a real thorn in the side of the government. And from becoming an immensely admired figure, and he was admired by all levels of society, he became, in the eyes of many, a traitor and a friend of Germany. And then his passionate concern about the ghastly slaughter on the Western Front. I mean, being an Ulsterman, 20,000 men were killed on the day of the Somme, first battle of the Somme, which was mainly the Ulster Division, in 1916. 20,000 people died in the battlefield on that day alone. And it was madness. I mean, this comes across tremendously in Morel's correspondence and his letters and his articles and his books. And I hope that, I have to say, I'm minded that this interest in the war will interest publishers, actually, because it is another phase and an area of the whole war, which is the opposition to it, which, quite frankly, the government did a great deal to suppress at the time. And it did eventually get him under the Defence of the Realm Act. Couldn't get him to court. Nobody dared take him to court because his command of the facts and figures was absolutely astonishing. And eventually they got him on a rather trumped-up charge of sending material to Switzerland, which is a neutral country which is which was forbidden under the Defence of the Realm Act. And in a way they got him sent to Pentonville. And I think that was what greatly damaged your great-grandfather's health there, because his angina was already quite bad, and it exacerbated his heart problems. There's no doubt about that. And I'm sure it shortened his life. He was buried in Pentonville for 6 months. It's one of the, we have all the correspondence between his wife Mary and himself during that time. It's in the archive, and it's very tragic in a way, and sad to read. But he came out of out of prison, and made an extraordinary recovery in many ways, because he'd been greatly put down by all this. But he went back. You couldn't keep him down. He just wasn't to be put down, and he was selected actually by the Liberal Party. He had been selected by the Liberal Party as the respective MP for Birkenhead before the war. And he went after the war. Once he came out of prison, he opened up, he got assistance actually with this, but he became the prospective parliamentary candidate for Dundee. And he stood in 1922 for the Labour seats, one of the Labour seats in Dundee. It was a remarkable election. He won 30,000 votes in Dundee, defeating, guess who? Winston Churchill. I mean, it was true that Winston Churchill had appendicitis and was not up to great form, but his agent, Lord Birkenhead, known as Gallagher Smith, actually, speaking for Winston Churchill, made an awful mess of his speech. He come up to here, up to Birkenhead, he came up to Dundee, but Lord Birkenhead had come up to Dundee, and he had to come up in the night train, so he arrived in Dundee early in the hours of the morning and went to the Conservative Club, or whatever it was, where I think he got totally drunk, or drank half a bottle of whiskey. But anyway, Clementine later said that he was not much use. She described him as not much use and drunk to boot. Anyway, Winston Churchill was defeated. He didn't do much campaigning himself. Birkenhead did most of that for him and failed. And he left Dundee, as he later said. Winston Churchill wrote himself actually saying he left without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix, because that was why he wasn't very well. He lost his. So Morel was responsible for sending Churchill into his years in the wilderness, his famous years in the wilderness. And but all this time was basically spent campaigning against the Versailles Treaty after the war, which is very complex to address in the book, particularly if you're not a real historian. So I probably said all sorts of things that are hostile to fortune. But he kept going, and mainly on the foreseeing another war. And of course he was quite absolutely right. He even foresaw, and writes about it in his letters, aerial bombardment as being a major feature of the next war. He was extraordinarily prescient. He said it was going to be in 10 years. That was the only thing he was wrong. It was about 20 years. But he knew there would be another war, and he placed the emphasis for that on the conditions of the Versailles Treaty. Now this is very, very contentious area, which I have done my best to address in the book. But there are historians who have written reams and reams about the Versailles Treaty, right or wrong. I take a rather neutral position, I have to. But anyway, he continued to campaign for peace and for peaceful outcome, and he won 3 seats. There were very early 1920s. There were 3 elections, one after the other. The Liberal Party, the Coalition Party was defeated, and then there was another election, and then there was another election again, bringing the Labour Party to power for the first time in its history in 1924. And Morel won of each of